2. The last bus had long gone before Mark left college, and he walked home up the hill in brilliant moonlight. Something happened to him the moment he had let himself into the flat, which was very unusual. He found himself on the doormat, embracing a frightened, half-sobbing Jane, even a humble Jane, who was saying, "Oh, Mark, I've been so frightened." There was a quality in the very muscles of his wife's body which took him by surprise. A certain indefinable defensiveness had momentarily deserted her. He had known such occasions before, but they were rare, and they were already becoming rarer. And they tended, in his experience, to be followed next day by inexplicable quarrels. This puzzled him greatly, but he never put his bewilderment into words. It is doubtful whether he could have understood her feelings even if they had been explained to him, and Jane, in any case, could not have explained them. She was in extreme confusion, but the reasons for her unusual behavior on this particular evening were simple enough. She had got back from the Dimbles at about 4:30, feeling much exhilarated by her walk and hungry, and felt quite sure that her experiences on the previous night and at lunch were over and done with. She had had to light up and draw the curtains before she had finished her tea, for the days were getting short. While doing so, the thought had come into her mind that her fright at her dream, and at the mere mention of a mantle, an old man buried but not dead, and a language like Spanish, had really been as irrational as a child's fear of the dark. This had led her to remember moments when she had feared the dark as a child. Perhaps she allowed herself to remember them too long. At any rate, when she sat down to drink her last cup of tea of the evening, she had somehow found it had further deteriorated. It never recovered. First, she found it rather difficult to keep her mind on her book. Then she had to acknowledge that she had to found it difficult to fix on any book. Then she realized that she was far from restless. She was actually nervous. Then followed a long time when she was not frightened, but knew that she would be very frightened indeed if she did not keep herself in hand. Then came a curious reluctance to go into the kitchen to get some supper, and difficulty, indeed an impossibility, of eating anything when she had got it. And now there was no disguising the fact that she was actually frightened. In desperation, she rang up the Dimbles. I think I might go and see the person you suggested after all," she said. Mrs. Dimble's voice came back after a curious little pause, giving her the address. Ironwood was the name, Miss Ironwood, apparently. Jane had assumed it would be a man, and was rather repelled. Miss Ironwood lived out at St. Anne's on the Hill. Jane asked if she could make an appointment. "No," said Mrs. Dimble. "There'll be... you needn't make an appointment." Jane kept the conversation going as long as she could. She had rung up chiefly to get the address, but also to hear Mother Dimble's voice. Secretly, she had a wild hope that Mother Dimble would recognize her distress and say at once, "I'll come straight around to you by car." Instead, she got the mere information and a hurried "Good night." It seemed to Jane that there was something queer about Mother Dimble's voice. She felt that by ringing up she had interrupted a conversation about herself. Or no, not about herself, but about something else more important, with which she was connected somehow. And what had Mrs. Dimble meant by "they'll be"? They'll be expecting you? Horrible childish nightmare visions of they expecting her passed before her mind. She saw Miss Ironwood dressed all in black, sitting with her hands folded on her knees, and then someone leading her into Miss Ironwood's presence and saying, "She's come," and leaving her there. "Damn the Dimbles!" said Jane to herself, and then unsaid it, more in fear than in remorse. And now that that lifeline had been used and brought no comfort, the terror, as if insulted by her futile attempt to escape it, rushed back on her with no possibility of disguise. And she could never afterwards remember whether the horrible old man and the mantle had actually appeared to her in a dream, or whether she had merely sat there, huddled and wide-eyed, hoping, even praying, though she believed no one to pray to, that they would not. And that is why Mark found such an unexpected Jane on the doormat. It was a pity, he thought, that this should have happened on a night when he was so late and so tired and, to tell the truth, not perfectly sober. "Do you feel quite all right this morning?" said Mark. "Yes, thank you," said Jane shortly. Mark was lying in bed and drinking a cup of tea. Jane was seated at the dressing table, partially dressed, and doing her hair. Mark's eyes rested on her with indolent, early-morning pleasure. If he guessed very little of the maladjustment between them, this was partly due to our race's incurable habit of projection. We think the lamb gentle because its wool is soft to our hands. Men call a woman voluptuous when she arouses voluptuous feelings in them. Jane's body, soft though firm and slim though rounded, was so exactly to Mark's mind that it was all but impossible for him not to attribute to her the same sensations which she excited in him. "You're quite sure you're all right?" he asked again. "Quite," said Jane more shortly still. Jane thought she was annoyed because her hair was not going up to her liking and because Mark was fussing. She also knew, of course, that she was deeply angry with herself for the collapse which had betrayed her last night into being what she most detested, the fluttering, tearful little woman of sentimental fiction running for comfort to male arms. But she thought this anger was only in the back of her mind, and had no suspicion that it was pulsing through every vein, and producing at that very moment the clumsiness in her fingers, which made her hair seem intractable. "Because," continued Mark, "if you felt at least uncomfortable, I could put off going to see this man with her." Jane said nothing. "If I did go," said Mark, "I'd certainly have to be away for the night, perhaps 2. Jane closed her lips a little more firmly, and still said nothing. "Supposing I did," said Mark, "you wouldn't think of asking Myrtle over to stay?" "No, thank you," said Jane emphatically, and then, "I'm quite accustomed to being alone." "I know," said Mark in a rather defensive voice. "That's the devil of the way things are in college at present. That's one of the chief reasons I'm thinking of another job." Jane was still silent. "Look here, old thing," said Mark, suddenly sitting up and throwing his legs out of bed. "There's no good beating around the bush. I won't feel comfortable about going away while you're in your present state." "What state?" said Jane, turning around and facing him for the first time. "Well, I mean, just a bit nervy, as anyone might be temporarily." "Because I happened to be having a nightmare when you came home last night, Or rather this morning. There's no need to talk as if I was a neurasthenic." This was not, at least, what Jane had intended or expected to say. "Now, there's no good going on like that," began Mark. "Like what?" said Jane icily, and then before he had time to reply, "If you've decided that I'm going mad, then you'd better get Brasacre to come down and certify me. It would be convenient for you to do while you're away. Then you could get me packed off while you're off with Mr. Wither without any fuss. I'm going to see about your breakfast now. If you don't shave and dress quickly, you won't be ready for when Lord Feverstone calls." The upshot of that was that Mark gave himself a really bad cut while shaving, and saw at once a picture of himself talking to the all-important Wither with a great blob of cotton wool on his upper lip, while Jane decided from a mixture of motives to cook Mark an unusually elaborate breakfast, of which she would rather die than eat any herself, and did so with the swift efficiency of an angry woman, only to upset it all over the new stove at the last moment. They were still at the table and both pretending to read newspapers when Lord Feverstone arrived. Most unfortunately, Mrs. Maggs arrived at the same moment. Mrs. Maggs was that element in Jane's economy represented by the phrase, "I have a woman who comes in twice a week." 20 years earlier, Jane's mother would have addressed such a functionary as Maggs, and been addressed by her as Mum, but Jane and her woman who came in called one another Mrs. Maggs and Mrs. Studdick. They were about the same age, and to a bachelor's eye there was no very noticeable difference in the clothes they wore. It was therefore perhaps not inexcusable that when Mark attempted to introduce Feverstone to his wife, Feverstone should have shaken Mrs. Maggs by the hand instead. But it did not sweeten the last few minutes before the two men departed. Jane left the flat under the pretence of shopping almost at once. "I really couldn't stand Mrs. Maggs today," she said to herself. "She's such a terrible talker." So that was Lord Feverstone, the man with the loud, unnatural laugh, and the mouth like a shark, and no manners. Apparently a perfect fool, too. What good could it do to Mark to go about with a man like that? Jane had distrusted his face. She could always tell there was something shifty about him. Probably he was making a fool of Mark. Mark was so easily taken in. If only he wasn't at Bracton. It was a horrible college. And what did Mark see in people like Mr. Curry and the odious old clergyman with the beard? And meanwhile, what of the day that awaited her, and the night, and the next night, and beyond that? For when men say they're going to be away for 2 nights, it means 2 nights in the minimum. They really hope to be away for a week. A telegram, never a trunk call, puts it all right as far as they're concerned. She must do something. She even thought of following Mark's advice and getting Myrtle to come and stay. But Myrtle was her sister-in-law, Mark's twin sister, with much too much of the adoring sister's attitude to the brilliant brother. She would talk about Mark's health and his shirts and his socks, with a continual undercurrent of unexpressed yet unmistakable astonishment at Jane's good luck in marrying him. No, certainly not Myrtle. Then she thought of going to see Dr. Brasacre as a patient. He was a Bracton man, and would therefore probably charge her nothing. But when she came to think of answering, to Brasacre of all people, the sort of questions which Brasacre would certainly ask, this turned out to be impossible. She must do something. In the end, somewhat to her own surprise, she found that she had decided to go out to St. Anne's and see Miss Ironwood. She thought herself a fool for doing so. 4. An observer placed at the right attitude above Edgestowe that day might have seen far to the south a moving spot on a main road, and later, to the east, much nearer, the silver thread of the wind, and much more slowly moving, the smoke of a train. The spot would have been the car which was carrying Mark Studdick towards the blood transfusion office at Belbury, where the nucleus of the NICE had taken up its temporary abode. The very size and style of the car had made a favourable impression on him the moment that he saw it. The upholstery was such a quality that one felt it ought to be good enough to eat. And what fine male energy, Mark felt sick of women at the moment, revealed itself in the very gestures with which Feverstone settled himself at the wheel, put his elbow on the horn, and clasped his pipe firmly between his teeth. The speed of the car, even in the narrow streets of Edgestowe, was impressive, and so were the laconic criticisms of Feverstone on other drivers and pedestrians. Once over the level crossing and beyond Jane's old college, St. Elizabeth's, he began to show what this car could really do. Their speed became so great that even on a rather empty road, the inexcusably bad drivers, the manifestly half-witted pedestrians and men with horses, the hen that they actually ran over, and the dogs and hens that Feverstone pronounced damned lucky, seemed to follow one after another without intermission. Telegraph poles raced by, bridges rushed overhead with a roar, villages streamed backward to join the country already devoured, and Mark, drunk with air and at once fascinated and repelled by the insolence of Feverstone's driving, sat saying, "Yes," and "Quite," and that was their fault," and stealing sidelong glances at his companion. Certainly, he was a change from the fussy importance of Curry and the bursar. The long straight nose and the clenched teeth, the hard bony outlines beneath the face, the very way he wore his clothes, all spoke of a big man driving a big car to somewhere they would find big stuff going on. And he, Mark, was to be in it all. At one or two moments when his heart came into his mouth, he wondered whether the quality of Lord Feverstone's driving quite justified its speed. "You can never take a crossroad like that seriously," yelled Feverstone, as they plunged on after the narrowest of these escapes. Quite," boiled Mark. "No good making a fetish of them." "Drive much yourself?" said Feverstone. "Used to a good deal," said Mark. The smoke, which our imaginary observer might have seen to the east of Edgestowe, would have indicated the train in which Jane Studdick was progressing slowly towards the village of St. Anne's. Edgestowe itself, those who had reached it from London, had the appearance of a terminus, but if you looked about you, you might see presently, in a little bay, a train, a small train of 2 or 3 coaches and a tank engine, a train that sizzled and exuded steam from beneath the floorboards, and in which most of the passengers seemed to know one another. On some days, instead of the 3rd coach, there might be a horse box, and on the platform there would be hampers containing dead rabbits and live poultry, and men in brown bowler hats and gaiters, and perhaps a terrier or a sheepdog that seemed to be used to travelling. In this train, which started at 1:30, Jane jerked and rattled along an embankment whence she looked down through some bare branches, and some branches flecked with red and yellow leaves, into Bragton Wood itself, and thence through the cutting and over the level crossing at Bragton Camp, and along the edge of Brawl Park — the great house was just visible at one point — and so to the first stop at Duke Eaton. Here, as at Woolham and Curhardy and Fourstones, The train settled back, and then it stopped with a little jerk and something like a sigh. And then there would be the noise of milk cans rolling and coarse boots treading on the platform. And after that a pause, which seemed to last long, during which the autumn sunlight grew warm on the window pane, and smells of wood and field from beyond the tiny station floated in and seemed to claim the railway as parts of the land. Passengers got in and out of her carriage at every stop. Apple-faced men, and women with elastic side boots and imitation fruit on their hats, and schoolboys. Jane hardly noticed them, for though she was theoretically an extreme Democrat, no social class save her own had yet become a reality to her in any place except the printed page. And in between the stations things flitted past, so isolated from their context that each seemed to promise some unearthly happiness, if one could have descended from the train at that very moment to seize it. A house backed with a group of haystacks and wide brown fields about it, 2 aged horses standing head to tail, a little orchard with a washing line hanging in it, and a rabbit staring at the train, whose 2 eyes looked like the dots and ears like the uprights of a double exclamation mark. At 2:15 she came to St. Anne's, which was the real terminus of the branch, and the end of everything. The air struck her as cold and tonic when she left the station. Although the train had been chugging and wheezing uphill for the latter part of the journey, there was still a climb to be done, on foot, for St. Anne's is one of those villages perched on a hilltop which are commoner in Ireland than in England, and the station was some way from the village. A winding road between high banks led her up to it. As soon as she had passed the church, she turned left, as she had been instructed, at the station cross. There were no houses on the left, only a row of beech trees in unfenced ploughland falls steeply away, and beyond that the timbered midland plain spreading as far as you could see, and blue in the distance. She was on the highest point of ground in that region. Presently she came to a high wall on her right that seemed to run on for a great way, and there was a door in it, beside the door an old iron bell-pull. A kind of flatness of spirit was on her. She felt sure that she had come on a fool's errand. Nevertheless she rang. When the jangling noise had ceased, there followed a silence so long, and in that upland place so chilly, that Jane began to wonder whether the house were inhabited. Then, just as she was debating whether to ring again or maybe to turn away, she heard the noise of someone's feet approaching briskly on the inside of the wall. Meanwhile, Lord Feverston's car had long since arrived at Belbury, a florid Edwardian mansion which had been built for a millionaire who admired Versailles. At the sides it seemed to have sprouted into a widespread outgrowth of newer cement buildings, which housed the blood transfusion office. Chapter 3. Belbury and St. Anne's on the Hill. 1. On his way up the wide staircase, Mark caught sight of himself and his companion in a mirror. Feverston looked as always, master of his clothes, his face, and the whole situation. The blob of cotton wool on Mark's upper lip had been blown awry during the journey, so it looked now like one half of a fiercely upturned false moustache, and revealed a patch of blackened blood beneath it. A moment later he found himself in a big windowed room with a blazing fire, being introduced to Mr. John Wither, Deputy Director of the NICE. Wither was a white-haired old man with a courtly manner. His face was clean-shaven and very large indeed, with watery blue eyes, and something rather vague and chaotic about it. He did not appear to be giving them his whole attention, and this impression must, I think, have been due to the eyes, for his actual words and gestures were polite to the point of effusiveness. He said that it was a very great pleasure to welcome Mr. Studdock among them. It added to the deep obligations under which Lord Feverstone had already laid him. He hoped that they had had an agreeable journey. Mr. Wither appeared to be under the impression that they had come by air, and when this was corrected, that they had come from London by train. Then he began inquiring whether Mr. Studdock found his quarters perfectly comfortable, and had to be reminded that they had only just this moment arrived. I suppose, thought Mark, the old chap is trying to put me at my ease. In fact, Mr. Wither's conversation was having precisely the opposite effect. Mark wished that he would offer him a cigarette. His growing conviction that this man really knew nothing about him, and even that all the well-knit schemes and promises of Feverstone were at this moment dissolving into some sort of mist, was extremely uncomfortable. At last he took his courage in both hands, and endeavouring to bring Mr. Wither to the point by saying that he was actually not quite clear in what capacity he would be able to assist the Institute. "I assure you, Mr. Studdock," said the Deputy Director, with an unusually far-away look in his eye, "that you needn't anticipate the slightest difficulty on that point. There was never any idea of circumscribing your activities and your general influence on policy, much less your relations with your colleagues, and what I might call in general terms of reference, under which you could be collaborating with us without the fullest possible consideration of your own views and indeed your own advice. You will find us, Mr. Studdock, if I might express myself in that way, a very happy family." "Oh, don't understand me, sir," said Mark. I didn't mean that at all. I only meant that I felt I should like some sort of idea as to exactly what I would be doing if I came to you." "Well, now, when you speak of coming to us," said the Deputy Director, "that raises a point on which I hope there is no misunderstanding. I think we all agree that no question of residency need be raised. I mean, at this stage, we all thought that you should be left entirely free to carry on your work wherever you pleased. If you care to live in London or Cambridge—" "Edgestowe," prompted Lord Feverstone. Yes, Edgestowe." Here the Deputy Director turned round and addressed Feverstone. "I was just explaining to Mr. Studdock, and I feel sure you will agree with me that nothing was further from the mind of the committee than to dictate in any way or even to advise where where your friend should live. Of course, wherever he lives, we should naturally place air transport and road transport at his disposal. I dare say, Lord Feverstone, you have already explained to him that he will find all questions of that sort will adjust themselves without the smallest difficulty." "But really, sir," said Mark, "I wasn't thinking about that at all. I mean, I shouldn't have the smallest objection to living anywhere. The Deputy Director interrupted him, if anything so gentle as Wither's voice could be called an interruption. "But I assure you, sir, that there is not the smallest objection to your residing wherever you may find it convenient. That was never at any stage the slightest suggestion." But here Mark, almost in desperation, ventured to interrupt himself. "It is the exact nature of the work," he said, "and my qualifications as to That I wanted to get clear."
"My dear friend," said the deputy director, "you need not have the slightest uneasiness in that direction. As I said before, you will find us a very happy family, and may feel perfectly satisfied that no questions as to your entire suitability have been agitating anyone's mind in the least. I should not be offering you a position among us if there were the slightest danger of your not being completely welcomed to all, or at least suspicion that your very valuable qualities were not fully appreciated. You are among friends here, Mr. Studdick. I should be the last person to advise you to connect yourself with any organizations where you ran the risk of being exposed to disagreeable personal contacts."
Mark did not ask again in so many words what the NIC wanted him to do, partly because he began to be afraid that he was supposed to know this already, and partly because a perfectly direct question would have sounded a crudity in that room, a crudity which might suddenly exclude him from the warm and almost drugged atmosphere of vague yet heavily important confidence in which he was gradually being enfolded. "You are very kind," he said. "The only thing I'd like to get just a little clearer is the exact scope of the appointment."
"Well," said Mr. Wither in a voice so low and rich that it was almost a sigh, "I am very glad that you have raised this issue now, in a quite informal way. Obviously, neither you nor I would wish to commit ourselves in this room in any sense which was at all injurious to the powers of the committee. I quite understand your motives and respect them. We are not, of course, speaking of an appointment in the quasi-technical sense of the term. It would be improper for both of us, though you may remind me in different ways to do so, or at least it might lead to certain inconveniences. But I think I can most definitely assure you that nobody wants to force you into any kind of strait waistcoat or bed of Procrustes. We do not really think among ourselves in terms of strictly demarcated functions, of course. I take it that men like you and me, well, to put it frankly, hardly in the habit of using concepts of that type. Everyone in the Institute feels that his own work is not so much a departmental contribution to an end already defined as a moment or grade in the progressive self-definition of the organic whole."
And Mark said, God forgive him, for he was young and shy and vain and timid all in one. "I do think that is so important. The elasticity of your organization is one of the things that attracts me the most." After that, he had no further chance of bringing the director to the point, and whenever the slow, gentle voice ceased, he found himself answering in its own style, and apparently helpless to do otherwise, despite the torturing reoccurrence of the question, "What are we both talking about?" At the very end of the interview there came a moment of clarity. Mr. Wither, supposing that he, Mark, would find it convenient to join the NICE club, even for the next few days, he would feel freer as a member than as someone's guest. Mark agreed, and then flushed crimson like a small boy on learning that the easiest course was to become a life member at the cost of £200. He had not that amount of money in the bank. Of course, if he had got the new job with its £1,500 a year, all would be well. But had he got it? Was there a job at all? "Oh, how silly,"
he said aloud. I haven't got my checkbook with me. A moment later he found himself on the stairs with Lord Feverstone. Well? Asked Mark eagerly. Feverstone did not seem to hear him. Well? Repeated Mark. When shall I know my fate? I mean, have I got the job? Hello, Guy! Bawled Feverstone suddenly to a man in the hall beneath. Next moment he had trotted down to the foot of the stairs, grasped his friend warmly by the hand, and disappeared. Mark, following him more slowly, found himself in the hall, silent, alone, and self-conscious among the groups and pairs of chattering men who were all crossing it towards the big folding doors on the left. Two. It seemed to last long, this standing, this wondering what to do, this effort to look natural and not to catch the eyes of strangers. The noise and the agreeable smells which came from the folding doors made it obvious that people were going to lunch. Mark hesitated, uncertain of his own status. In the end he decided that he couldn't stand there looking like a bloody fool any longer, and went in. He had hoped that there would be several small tables at one of which that he could have sat alone, but there was only a single long table, already so nearly filled that, after looking in vain for Feverstone, he had to sit down beside a stranger. "I suppose one just sits where he likes," he murmured as he did so, but the stranger apparently did not hear. He was a bustling sort of man who was eating very quickly and talking at the same time to his neighbour on the other side. "That's just it," he was saying. "As I told him, it makes no difference to me what way they settle it. I've no objection to the IJP people taking over the whole thing, if that's what the DD wants. But what I dislike is one man being responsible for it when half the work is being done by someone else. As I said to him, you've got 3 HDs all tumbling over one another at the same job that could really be done by a clerk. It's becoming ridiculous. Look at what happened this morning." And conversation on these lines continued throughout the meal. Although the food and drinks were excellent, it was a relief to Mark when people began getting up from table. Following the general movement, he recrossed the hall and came into a large room furnished as a lounge, where coffee was being served. Here at last he saw Feverstone. Indeed, it would have been difficult not to notice him, for he was at the centre of a group and laughing prodigiously. Mark wished to approach him, if only to find out whether he was expected to stay the night, and if so, whether a room had been assigned to him. But the knot of men around Feverstone was of that sort, was of that confidential kind which was difficult to join. He moved towards one of the many tables and began turning over the glossy pages of an illustrated weekly. Every few seconds he looked up to see if there were any chance of getting a word with Feverstone alone. The 5th time he did so, he found himself looking into the face of one of his own colleagues, a fellow of Bracton called William Hingst. The progressive element called him, though not to his face, Bill the Blizzard. Hingst had not, as Curry anticipated, been present at the college meeting and was hardly on speaking terms with Lord Feverstone. Mark realized with a certain awe that here was a man directly in touch with the NICE, one who started, so to speak, at a point beyond Feverstone. Hingst was also a physical chemist. He was one of the 2 scientists at Bracton that had a reputation outside of England. Look, I hope the reader at this point has not been misled into supposing that the Fellowship of Bracton was a specially distinguished body. It was certainly not the intention of the progressive element to elect mediocrities to fellowships, but their determination to elect sound men cruelly limited their field of choice, and as such, as Busby had once said,
You can't have everything." Bill the Blizzard was an old-fashioned, curly-moustached man in which white had almost, but not completely, triumphed over yellow, a large beak-like nose and a bald head. "Well, this is an unexpected pleasure," said Mark with a hint of formality. He was always a little afraid of Hingst.
"Huh?" grunted Bill. "Eh? Oh, it's you, Stannick. Didn't know they'd secured your services here."
"I was sorry not to see you at the college meeting yesterday," said Mark. This was a lie. The progressive element always found Hinks's presence an embarrassment. As a scientist, and the only really eminent scientist they had, he was their rightful property, but he was a hateful anomaly, the wrong sort of scientist. Glossop, who was a classic, was his chief friend in college. He had the air, the affectation, as Curry called it, of not attaching much importance to his own revolutionary discoveries in chemistry, and of valuing himself much more on being a Hingst. The family was almost of mythical antiquity, never contaminated, as the 19th century historian had said, by traitor, placeman, or baronetcy. He had given particular offence on the occasion of de Broglie's visit to Edgestowe. The Frenchman had spent his spare time exclusively in Bill the Blizzard's society, but when an enthusiastic junior fellow had thrown out a feeler about the rich feast of science which the two savants must have shared, Bill the Blizzard had appeared to search his memory for a moment, and replied that he didn't think that they had got on to that subject.
"Guessing almanac to gather nonsense, I suppose," was Curry's comment, though not in Hingst's presence. "Hey, what's that? College meeting?" said the Blizzard. "What were they talking about?"
About the sale of Bragdon Wood."
"All nonsense," muttered the Blizzard.
"I hope you would have agreed with the decision we came to."
"Made no difference what decision they came to."
"Oh?" said Mark with some surprise.
"It's all nonsense. The NICE would have had the wood in any case. They had powers to compel a sale."
"What an extraordinary thing. I was given to understand that they were going to Cambridge if we didn't sell."
Hingst sniffed loudly. "Not a word of truth in it. As to being an extraordinary thing, that depends on what you mean. There's nothing extraordinary in the fellows of Bracton talking all afternoon about an unreal issue. There's nothing extraordinary in the fact that the NICE should wish, if possible, to hand over to Bracton the odium of turning the heart of England into a cross between an abortive American hotel and a glorified gasworks. The only real puzzle is why the NICE should want that bit of land."
"I suppose we will find out as things go on."
"You may. I shan't."
"Oh?" said Mark interrogatively.
"I've had enough of it," said Hingst, lowering his voice. "I'm leaving tonight. I don't know what you were doing at Bracton, but if it was any good, I'd advise you to go back and stick to it."
"Really?" said Mark. "Why do you say that?"
"Doesn't matter for an old fellow like me," said Hingst. "But they could play the devil with you. Of course it all depends on what a man likes."
"As a matter of fact," said Mark, "I hadn't fully made up my mind." He'd been taught to regard Hingst as a warped reactionary. "I don't even know what yet my job would be if I stayed."
"What's your subject?"
"Sociology."
"Huh," said Hingst. "In that case, I can point you out to the man you'll be under. A fellow called Steele, over there by the window, do you see?"
"Oh, perhaps you could introduce me."
"You're determined to stay, then?"
"Well, I suppose I ought to at least see him."
"All right," said Hingst. "No business of mine." Then he added in a louder voice, "Steele! Steele!"
Steele turned round. He was a tall, unsmiling man with a kind of face which, though long and horse-like, has nevertheless rather thick and pouting lips.
"This is Studdick," said Hingst, "the new man for your department."
Then he turned away.
"Oh?" said Steele after a pause. "Did he say my apartment?"
That's what he said," replied Mark with an attempt at a smile. "Perhaps he's got it wrong. I'm supposed to be a sociologist, if that throws any light on it."
"I'm H.D. for sociology, all right," said Steele, "but this is the first I've heard about it. Who told you would be there?"
"Well, as a matter of fact," said Mark, "the whole thing is rather vague. I've just had a talk with the deputy director, but he didn't actually go into details."
"How did you manage to see him?"
"Lord Feverstone introduced me."
Steele whistled. "I say, Cosser," he called out to a freckle-faced man who was passing by, "listen to this. Feverstone has just unloaded this chap on our department, taken him straight to the DD without saying a word to me about it. What do you think of that?"
"Well, I'm damned," said Crosser, hardly glancing at Mark, but looking very hard at Steele. "I'm sorry," said Mark, a little bit more loudly and a little bit more stiffly than he had yet spoken. "Don't be alarmed. I seem to have been put in a rather false position. There must have been some misunderstanding. As a matter of fact, at the moment I'm merely having a look round. I'm not at all certain that I intend to stay in any case." Neither of the two took any notice of this last suggestion.
"This is Feverstone all over," said Crosser to Steele.
Steele turned to Mark.
"I shouldn't advise you to take much notice of what Lord Feverstone says here," he remarked. "This isn't his business after all."
"All I object to," said Mark, wishing he could prevent his face from turning red, "is being put in a false position. I only came over as an experiment. It is a matter of indifference to me whether I take the job at the NICE or not."
"You see," said Steele to Cosser, "there isn't any room for a man in our show, especially for someone who doesn't know the work, unless they put him on the UI."
"That's right," said Crosser.
"Mr. Studdick, I think,"
said a new voice at Mark's elbow. A treble voice which seemed disproportionate to the huge hill of a man whom he saw when he turned his head. He recognized the speaker at once. His dark, smooth face and black hair were unmistakable, and so was his foreign accent. This was Professor Philostrato, the great physiologist, whom Mark had sat next to at a dinner some 2 years before. He was fat to the degree of which is comic on the stage, but the effect is not funny in real life. Mark was charmed that such a man should have remembered him.
"I am very glad that you have come to join us," said Philostrato,
taking a hard hold of Mark's arm and gently piloting him away from Steele and Cosser. "To tell the truth," said Mark, "I'm not sure that I have. I was brought over by Feverstone, but he's disappeared, and Steele, I'm supposed to be in his department, I suppose. He didn't even seem to know anything about me."
"Bah, Steele," said the professor.
That is all a bagatelle. He got too big for his boots. He'll be put into his place one of these days. It may be you who will put him there. I have read all your work. See, do not consider him.
I have a strong objection to being put in a false position, began Mark.
Listen, my friend, interrupted Philostrato. You must put all such ideas out of your head. The first thing is to realize that the NICE is serious. It is nothing less than the existence of the human race that depends on our work, our real work. You comprehend? You will find frictions and impertinences among this canaglia, this rabble. They are no more to be regarded than your dislike of a brother officer when the battle is at a crisis.
So long as I'm giving something to do that is worth doing, said Mark. I shouldn't allow anything of that sort to interfere with it.
Yes, that is right. Your work is more important than you can yet understand. You will see these steers at Fever Stone is. They are of no consequence. As long as you have the goodwill of the deputy director, you snap your fingers at them. You need listen to no one but him. You comprehend? Ah, and there is one order. Do not have the ferry for your enemy. For the rest, you laugh at them. The ferry? Yes, her they call the ferry. Oh my God, a terrible inglesiation. She is the head of our police, the institution of police. Ecco, she come. I present you. Miss Hardcastle. Permit that I present you Mr. Staddock.
Mark found himself writhing from the stoker or carter's hand grip of a big woman in a black, short-skirted uniform. Despite a bust that would have done credit to a Victorian barmaid, she was rather thickly built than fat, and her iron-grey hair was cropped short. Her face was square, stern, and pale, and her voice deep. A smudge of lipstick laid on it with violent inattention to the real shape of her mouth was her only concession to fashion, and she rolled or chewed a long black cheroot, unlit, between her teeth. As she talked, she had a habit of removing this, staring intently at the mixture of lipstick and saliva on its mangled end, and then replacing it more firmly than before. She sat down immediately in a chair close to where Mark was standing, flung her right leg over one arm, and fixed him with a cold gaze of intimacy. And I think with the interruption, with the introduction is what I meant to say, of the fairy, I think that's where we will leave it. She's a fascinating character, and you're going to find her very interesting in the chapters to come. Interesting is an understatement, as you will see. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the reading today. I hope you've enjoyed the interesting and varied characters that dwell at the NICE. I hope the intrigue of it is starting to get a bit more interesting. Do you know, the funny thing is, when I read this book for the first time, I was a teenager. I think it was about 17 or 18 when I first explored this book. And I had my own experience at a strange place. Would you believe it was a job had advertised for something, and I went to have a look at it because it sounded interesting, and it turned out to be at the Church of Scientology, which I didn't know anything about at the time. And because I'd read that Hideous Strength, I couldn't help but feeling, as I was sort of introduced to all of these strange things. I doubt that it's probably much different if you